targets, and with targets that imply balanced growth. I will return a bit later to the issue of alternative policy frameworks. Ensuring that independence delivers good, socially optimal outcomes, however, also requires that it is conditioned by a complementary framework that ensures transparency and accountability. Paul Tucker, a former deputy governor of the Bank of England, in his recent book, set out in this way. Central bank delegation should have the following principles, and I quote: a clearly articulated regime, simple instruments, principles for the exercise of discretion, transparency that is not deceptive, engagement with multiple audiences, and more crucially, testimony to legislative committees, close quote. In line with those principles, in order to get to low inflation, central banks need to explain what they are doing and how they are doing it to the public. And they also need to be held accountable for their efforts. Independence is the flip side of accountability. A central bank cannot be easily held to account if private or political actors have the ability to sway the bank's decisions. Nor can a transparent target be easily manipulated to show success when there is in fact none. Our mandate is implemented by targeting an inflation rate which is interpreted not as literal price stability, meaning an inflation rate of 0%, but as a low and stable growth rate in the price level. Our targeted inflation rate, set in consultation with the government, is a range of inflation between 3 and 6% on an ongoing annual basis. In other words, we target a monthly year-on-year inflation rate of not lower than 3% and not higher than 6%. In practice, we want to aim for inflation to come out near the middle of our target range, around 4.5%. This gives scope for variation and shocks to hit the economy. These shocks move inflation above and below 4.5%, but by design of our framework do not necessarily require policy adjustments. This is the meaning of flexible inflation targeting. Let me touch on, let me just elaborate a little bit on this and say a flexible inflation targeting framework allows us considerable leeway. Since the beginning of the inflation targeting period, which started in the year 2000, our average annual inflation rate has been 5.5%, a full percentage point higher than the midpoint. This points to mixed success in the history of our inflation management. But inflation has stayed moderate, well below the high levels of the 1980s and 1990s. But inflation has not really been sufficiently low to get our high long-term interest rates lower. And this creates an economic cost that weighs more heavily on job creation as time goes on. We have indicated that a considerably lower rate in the near term, at the midpoint of our target band at 4.5%, would lower long-term interest rates and be more supportive of balance in the economy. What do we mean by balance? First, let me say what it is not. Balance is not about achieving an inflation rate that meets the demand of some groups of people but not others. And it is not about reaching an inflation rate that causes economic damage, neither too low nor too high. Balance is about supporting competitiveness and job creation in export industries and reducing the bias to growth in non-tradable sectors caused by high inflation. As it happens for most countries, emerging and advanced, that inflation target is between 2 and 3%. Our trading partners and competitors typically have lower inflation than we do. It is also about getting the balance right between saving and investing. Inflation should be at or around a rate which maximizes both the supply of credit and the demand of it. So, why would anyone want higher inflation? Prices at different rates? Some sectors may see stronger rises than others, giving them stronger revenue growth relative to those not seeing the same price increases. This implies redistribution. For example, some businesses like higher inflation because via currency depreciation, it increases the price of goods they sell faster than the cost of production. Of course, the costs eventually catch up as inflation rises in response to the weaker currency. But while prices are catching up, exporters get a small and temporary gain. In this instance, higher inflation redistributes a little from exporters in other countries that compete with ours. But more importantly, it redistributes from domestic consumers and producers to those gaining from higher prices. Once costs rise, however, then the economy is back to where it started in the first place. Along similar lines, debtors prefer higher inflation because over time, it reduces the real value of their debt, and governments are notorious for it. A particular example I like to think about, though, is those who want higher inflation because they like to borrow to make their living out of short-term activities, often in financial markets. Their frequent criticisms are always the same. We worry too much about inflation, both now and in the future. And if we didn't worry so much about inflation, we would all enjoy lower short-term interest rates today. The catch here is when short rates today push up inflation in the long run, then borrowing for investment is skewed away from the long term to the short term. We shouldn't be surprised if this also skews job creation away from the types of jobs that are sustained over the long run. That is not a trade-off that we believe is consistent with the public good mandate set out in the Constitution. The real test of monetary policy is not the short-term interest rate, but what happens to the long-term rate. We should by now be able to recognize the problem with allowing inflation to go up in ways that benefit some groups. The gain is temporary and it costs other groups. To claim back what they have lost, losers want compensation, which creates additional negative distortions. And because the advantage is temporary, the beneficiaries want policy to give them the gain again and again. Giving in to this desire, trying to conjure up temporary gains, lies behind many, if not most, historical instances of macroeconomic failure. Let me turn now quickly to the losers from high inflation. There are three social groups that we should all worry quite a lot about for both economic and ethical reasons. The first is younger people. Higher inflation and higher interest rate make it more expensive and often impossible to start borrowing for housing, education, or transport, or starting new businesses. The second are workers. Here it is often argued that more inflation would create more jobs for blue-collar workers. Well, this is the old idea of the Phillips curve. It is an old idea and has proved, except in very particular circumstances, to be wrong. First, some basic facts. For South Africa, the economy grows more strongly when inflation is low. If you don't believe me, take a look at the historical data series for yourself. And we had captured this in a monetary policy review of 2016. Second, let's move to some empirics. The original Phillips curve idea worked as follows. If there are suddenly higher prices, businesses will believe it is strong real demand. They respond to this demand by increasing production because they think they will be able to sell more and because their return is higher relative to the cost of production. But this is not time consistent. When workers respond to their real loss of income, they ask for higher wages and the cost of production rises. Suddenly, the business is not any longer more profitable. It cannot sell more of its product and it starts to retrench workers. In macroeconomic policy, the temporary gain of the Phillips curve is really illusory. You end up with less employment and higher inflation. Yet, the misery index has increased. Yes, there is such a thing invented by a certain Arthur Ockham, and it measures exactly that, misery. Finally, I want to note that the group that gets hurt most by higher inflation include those that cannot defend themselves from it, and that is the poor. Without the power to demand higher compensation for inflation, the poor and those living off fixed nominal incomes, pensioners in particular, are more vulnerable. It is for these groups, above all others, for which low inflation is both morally and economically right. At the end of the day, central bank independence allows the bank to hear what different interest groups have to say, but gives the bank the policy space to make decisions about inflation that on balance benefit all. By having an inflation target, we make a commitment to explaining transparently how we have achieved that target. Independence also matters for ensuring effective fiscal and monetary policy coordination. Much monetary theory involves figuring out how to avoid high inflation and its impoverishing effects. Sometimes, high inflation is caused by excessive ambitions of sovereigns to spend fiscal resources on projects that do little to generate long-run economic growth. Continuous fiscal deficits reflect those ambitions, and because those deficits are financed with debt, they create a tax liability for citizens in the future. Put simply, they create intergenerational inequity. When debt rises too rapidly and above certain level, our borrowing today both constrains what future generations of South Africans can do. They are forced to repay our debt and undermine their own living standards as they pay higher taxes. And all of this directly generates pressure to allow inflation to rise. Now we cannot blame future generations for this. It is a function of the choices we make now. What intergenerational equity means is that we cannot allow the excesses of today's generation to put a burden on our children and their children's children. Some of you may object to this and argue that governments need to address social deficits and therefore always run large deficits. But while I certainly agree those social deficits need to be rectified, it has to be done sustainably and with a critical emphasis on spending public funds on things that raise the potential growth rate of the economy. If our spending does not do this, then we will end up not being able to spend more in the future. Future generations will simply end up paying more interest and more taxes. Avoiding what is called fiscal dominance, that is, the need for monetary policy to prevent the sovereign from going bankrupt because excessive spending for current consumption, is another important argument for giving central banks independence. Let me now turn to a discussion of inflation targeting expansion of our mandate. Discussing how inflation targeting is dealt with in South Africa is a good expression of our constitutional mandate to support balanced and sustainable growth. Independence for central bank also gives them the opportunity to keep on top of the global research and use human capital to best understand how to achieve their mandates. Oftentimes, criticism of independence is really about not liking the objective as set out in the Constitution. If the SAP had no independence, then better objectives could be imposed on it. But what are those better objectives? Where do they come from? Have they been researched and understood properly? Or are they just wishful thinking? Perhaps they reflect good intentions and legitimate aspirations. But the test of whether they are the right or even useful objectives have to be based on analysis and research, comparative assessment, and technical know-how. Inflation targeting has in recent times become a popular policy framework mainly because it has proven successful in achieving good outcomes where others have failed. Nonetheless, it is always useful to consider the alternatives. But what are these alternatives? Well, dual frameworks are one alternative. But even central banks with multiple mandates tend to act as if they are inflation targeters, because low inflation helps to keep interest rates low, and the two together help to maximize employment. The mandate is achieved because the rate of inflation determines the sustainable outcome of the other two objectives. For this reason, the move to include employment as a mandate alongside inflation target for the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has proven to be less eventful than its political sponsors advertised it to be. Why? One reason is that employment levels are determined by many different things. So, putting a specific target on it for the central bank to try to achieve is unrealistic and could result in unintended consequences. Say, for example, employment is falling because of adverse technological change and inflation is rising. In this instance, there is little monetary policy can do to increase employment levels. But responding by cutting interest rates, which seems like it might be the right thing to do, just to increase inflation, and eventually it undermines job creation even further. Like other central banks, we already include concern about growth and employment in our Taylor rule. And because we apply the framework flexibly, we don't respond with policy to every upward move in inflation. The difference between a flexible inflation target and a dual mandate central bank just isn't very meaningful because they look very much alike. Over time, keeping inflation expectations low and well anchored is the clearest and most effective way of helping the economy to achieve full employment. Another alternative is to target the exchange rate directly. Keeping it perfectly stable would, at least on the surface, suggest a better fit with the letter of the mandate in the Constitution. But it is often not well understood just what maintaining a fixed currency actually means, nor what it requires in terms of policy. In a nutshell, fixing the currency requires fixing it against another currency or basket of currencies. Then, our fiscal and monetary policies are required to adjust regularly to keep the rand's value stable against those currencies. But those third currencies are moving, and that means that we need to move our policies in line with their moves, even when the economic costs may be high. Put simply, pegging the exchange rate amounts to outsourcing our fiscal and our monetary policies to some other jurisdiction that we have decided to peg our currency to. To give you a concrete example of how problematic this can be, let us consider the case of Argentina in the early 1980s. Argentina pegged its currency to the US dollar. But Argentina was not as productive as the United States, despite the peg giving them a similar inflation rate. Eventually, Argentina couldn't afford to maintain the peg. As the peso's value was under pressure, to fall, and it had no reserves left to defend the peg. The peg was dropped, and the economy fell into deep recession, with very high inflation, massive job losses, and a sharp rise in poverty. Now, you may think Argentina is an extreme case, but it demonstrates how a country's policies become subordinate and ultimately determined by actions of other countries. Our inflation targeting framework and floating currency means that we have considerable freedom to set our policies in line with the inflation outcome that we want to achieve. Some commentators have suggested that this freedom to float the currency means that our monetary policy works against export-led growth. Our currency is too strong in this view. It is worth reminding ourselves, though, what the International Growth Panel, led by Professor Ricardo Hausmann, suggested to us back in 2006. They showed us how a more export-led growth strategy needs to be predicated on a more competitive exchange rate achieved by running a fiscal surplus to create space for lower interest rates and supplemented by an effective inflation targeting framework. In fact, under inflation targeting, excessive exchange rate appreciation has been rare and short-lived. These discrete periods occurred when capital flowed in as a result of high commodity prices, sustained public borrowing, and low yields in advanced economies, not because of inflation targeting. The inflation targeting framework, all else being equal, has lowered inflation and rates, reducing the pull on hot money in recent times. In fact, a fundamental objective of inflation targeting was to achieve a more competitive exchange rate, and the best way to achieve that is to get inflation to be permanently low. High inflation begets high interest rates. If you want low interest rates, you must have low inflation. There aren't ifs or buts, only difficult decisions to be made. And as I draw this to conclusion, let me re-emphasize. The Constitution recognizes and expresses the public good, which is price stability, because it helps societies achieve balanced and sustainable growth. It is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. Like the mandate, central bank independence is also not static, some ivory tower concept. It is a living and breathing idea. It is an idea that is practical. It gives life to the mandate set out for the bank in the Constitution. That independence means that the bank can make the case for how best to achieve that goal in consultation with government and with full transparency to the general public. As an institution, we worked with government to identify the inflation targeting framework as the best way of achieving the mandate, for all the reasons I have set out to you today. We believe, as the central bank, that the case for the existing framework is very strong. We have achieved an historically low rate of inflation, and as a direct consequence of that, historically low interest rates. Of course, we would like to improve on this track record and edge inflation and interest rates lower on a sustainable basis. This is the most important contribution monetary policy can make to full employment, economic growth, and the well-being of our society. To bring down the cost of capital in this economy, let me reiterate what I had said earlier. For us to get the lower cost of capital, we must bring the inflation rate lower. For higher inflation begets higher interest rates. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.
Thank you, Governor. I think that's probably one of the clearest lectures I've heard in a very, very long time. So thank you. So I suspect that there isn't much more